Hi, and welcome back to the Mind of the Writer. So in this week's video, I wanted to talk about incorporating old-fashioned or archaic words into your writing and creating and making up new words for your writing, as well as incorporating words from different languages into your writing. And then I want to relate this to the way that you can use it to perceive the world or to create a more reverent experience in your life off page or in your experiences off page. So, to begin, I want to reiterate that I'm looking at the poem as if it were a prayer or a hymn or a piece of work that has a certain reverence and divinity to it, and I realize that reverence and divinity will differ from person to person in how everybody, views that. But definitely to look at the poem in this way, metaphorically. So let's begin with these words. So a word that I've used recently in my writing is the word bon has, and this is a Germanic word. It is an Old English word and it means the human body, but what it literally means is bone house or house of bones. By using the word bone house in my writing, what I'm doing is I'm drawing your attention to the fact that the body is a shelter, a refuge, a haven, a house. And then you start to think, well, what is it a shelter, a haven, and a house for? That then leads you to think about spirit, soul, character, the things that are not so tangible within the house of bones. If I just use the word body, it's very straightforward, but it doesn't have hooks into those other thoughts. And so I think by using an archaic word like bon house, I can definitely start to encourage the reader to think about things at perhaps a deeper level. Some other words that I use are bequeath, beguile, and much obliged. These are more, in my mind, more Victorian words, but of course they were probably used, much before or long before. So bequeath or give. If I use the word give, it's a very straightforward word, give. If I use the word bequeath, that word into it has this idea of legacy, of something being passed on from generation to generation. It has a depth to it that the word give doesn't. And so by introducing a word like bequeath into a poem, all of a sudden I'm giving this idea of longevity, of things that are being passed on and progressing from generation to generation, whereas give is just quite surface and not as deep. Beguile or seduce. Well, seduce is very straightforward as well, but beguile is seduction, but it's seduction with a sense of romance, with a sense of perhaps mystique to it, with a softness that seduction doesn't have. And so there are nuances in beguile, just as there are nuances in bequeath that the very straightforward words that we use today perhaps don't capture. Much obliged, the same thing. I can say thank you or thanks, but if I use those words, it doesn't have the idea of reciprocity built into it. If you think of much obliged, there's a sense of something being owed, something coming back in return for whatever has been done. So much obliged, again, has nuances and has a little bit of depth to it that thanks does not, or thankfulness does not. By using these older, more archaic words, we can start to accommodate some of these things that perhaps have been lost, or nuances that have been lost in our very busy digital modern day world. When it comes to making words up, I think that creativity is meant to push the boundaries. Creativity is leading you, inviting you to think outside of the accepted context. That's what being creative is all about. And nobody says that you can't make words up. There's no law saying that that you can't create words. And so that's all part of the fun of writing. And often I know when I'm writing, I'll come up at something that I want to express and there's no exact word for it. And so I will turn nouns into verbs, and I'll turn verbs into nouns, and I will play around like that. And to me, it's the same as coming up with a new dance step or mixing a different combination of colors to come up with something new. And so I think that that is also a very exciting part of writing, that you are blending the old with the yet to be born when it comes to language. I think as well that incorporating words from other languages into poetry in your own language is perfectly acceptable. I'm going to deal with English, obviously, because that's what I'm writing in most of the time. But there are many words from other languages that are international in a way. And so by using these words in an English poem, an English speaker will immediately know what they mean. And you might be incorporating these words to maintain a certain rhythm in the sentence, or again, because the word doesn't exist in English. So because Spanish is my other language, I've just picked out a few words here, and I'm sure that you'll know what they mean. But siesta, sol, luna, rosa, these are words that are fairly commonly known, and you could easily pop into an English sentence or an English poem. Another expression that I really like that we don't have an exact word for in English is clair de lune. And of course, clair de lune is the glow around the moon, and you can extend that to clair de soleil and clair d'étoile, so the glow around the sun, the glow around a star. And because I tend to write quite explicitly, not in my poetry, but in my serial novel, I will often use things like that to describe body parts, again, to sort of bring a celestial nature or heavenly nature to something that's very physical on the human body. And so, clair de lune is one of the words that I have definitely used to describe areola, for example. And it's just a way of taking that body part and giving it this sort of beautiful sense of heaven, of course, because the clair de lune is in the sky. So how does this work when it comes to looking at the way that we operate in our off-page lives and our off-page experiences? Well, I would say that right now there's a fair amount of dialogue and contention about the changes in language and changes accommodating new ways of thinking and new ways of being in the world. And these discussions can get very, very polemic, very, very heated. As a person who loves language and loves looking at the evolution of language, well, I would say, and I know I've said this before, but language is always changing. It's always evolving. Most of our languages are amalgamation of several languages. And so language is never static. I think with this video, I'm going to post some links to videos where you can hear the evolution of the English language. My attitude is that if we didn't adapt and change, it would be absolutely ridiculous, and we'd all be, talking as people were talking in the Middle Ages, and of course it's just not even possible. And so when you are creating words to accommodate a thought that perhaps there is no word for, I think that is very, it's very accurate as to what has happened in society, because in the last 20 years, we've had all sorts of words that have cropped up to accommodate the changes in technology, and we just simply didn't have those words before because we didn't have those things that we needed to describe or that we needed to convey. it also gives you a great appreciation for the nuances that exist in the languages of other people, and maybe for the nuances that exist in our own language that don't exist in other languages. In other words, if you look at a language like Spanish, and this is the other one that I'm familiar with, it has words that perhaps we don't have in English, and so that on their part, on Spanish speakers' part, that is an acknowledgement of a nuance that we don't accommodate in our language. And so I think that by doing this, by bringing back these archaic, old-fashioned words, by creating new words, by using words that are from other languages, you are developing in yourself an appreciation for the way that language changes in the off-page world, and for the nuances that exist in your own language and in other people's language too. With regards to the more archaic language, and going back to the idea of a poem as a prayer or a hymn or something that's very reverent, and I did mention this in one of my videos, that many times when we go into a place of worship, we're using old-fashioned and archaic texts, and often the language in those texts is very beautiful. I believe that if we use and revive the non-contentious words and the non-contentious, non-polemic words in those texts, that we can really instill a sense of beauty in our modern day writing. So that's my message for today, and we will see you next week on The Mind of the Writer. Thank you.